So, hi everyone. I am Diana Yan, and one of the pediatric ER attendings at Mount Sinai Beth Israel in New York City. And we are excited to be moderating the session entitled The Grant Process, how to decide on a grant, and also what to do once you have picked one or two to apply for. So we have three amazing panelists here, and we will introduce each one separately, and then Eric will give a short primer on the grant process, and then we will have each panelist talk about their own project and grant that brought them here, and then we'll open it up to questions. All right, so first is Dr. Hilary Moss. She is an EM attending and assistant director of simulation education and the director of PANP education at Montefiore in the Bronx. She has been an integral part of the resident simulation program at Montefiore, helping them to expand the weekly didactics, and is always looking for new ways to innovate and improve the program there. She's also been slowly increasing her research presence within the simulation community with recent publications on survey validation and in situ sim. She recently was awarded the SAEM Simulation Academy Novice Research Grant for her project, creating a novel simulation-based palliative care curriculum for EM residents, where she will be building and implementing a standardized patient-based simulation curriculum for palliative care. And she will be looking at resident attitudes towards it and then knowledge of palliative care before and after her intervention. And then she's also going to be looking for clinical behavioral changes after implementation. And this is actually her second panel this year, so we are very excited to have her again. Jared Kutnitz is an associate professor of emergency medicine and medical education at Mount Sinai or Icahn School of Medicine, and is the senior director of simulation teaching and research at Mount Sinai in our simulation center. He is a registered nurse with advanced degrees in health policy and management, public health, leadership, and medical education. And he is currently on the board of directors for the Society of Simulation and Healthcare and deputy editor of MedEd Portal. While he is very well published and is a part of many fellowships and international organizations, today he's going to be talking about about all the simulation grants that he has obtained. In particular, he is the winner of the 2021 INACSL Deborah Spunt Research Grant.
We usually say an Axel.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, that does make it a lot easier. Thanks, guys. Probably should have asked beforehand. All right. So Eric Bonfillo, I hope I'm saying that right, is currently an instructor and a research fellow in the Department of Emergency Medicine and a fellow in the Department of Healthcare Delivery and Population Sciences at UMass Chan Medical School in Bay State. He is the past recipient of the 2020 SAEM Foundation Resident and Medical Student and the 2022 SAEM Sim Academy Novice Research Grant Awards. He'll be starting his position as the Director of Research and serving as a core faculty member in the Department of Emergency Medicine within the Memorial Healthcare System in South Florida after completing his MPH degree at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health this summer. All right, and so we will start with Eric giving his primer. I think you have the ability to share slides, yes.
Okay, can everyone see the slides okay? Hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So I'm just coming off a shift. It was a great shift, 80% borders. My second cup of coffee in the afternoon just kicked in, so I'm ready to go. So today, I'm sorry I prepared a presentation. I didn't realize it was a panel discussion until after the slides were made. I was actually just recently at the SAEM Foundation, EM Foundation grant recipient workshop in Bethesda. I'm talking with some of the program officers from the NIH about 3 weeks ago. And there was a presentation about the grant mechanism process. And so I wish I had waited to do my slides until afterwards, but I was able to incorporate some of the stuff that I learned into the slide. Obviously, first is the worst. You're going to save the best for last. I'm probably the most junior of the panel here in terms of training clinically. post-residency, and then also in terms of the grants I've received. But that might be interesting for some of you, if you find yourself as a resident, maybe considering fellowship or applying for some of these early investigator awards. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the grant process. There we go. Quick outline. We'll talk specifically about finding the right grant, preparing the grant, actually sitting and writing it. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the scoring and reviewing process of grants, just so you have an idea of how the grants are scored, which may eventually lead to being awarded. I'll probably say this multiple times throughout the presentation. Writing grants and applying for grants is really, there's a lot of gamesmanship to it. There's a certain way of doing it. And if you know the secrets, not only can you increase your funding opportunities, but also get better scores earlier on and achieve grant funding with less submissions. So how do you find the right grant? Well, there's really no one place to search, right? You can look online. Maybe you hear about it from people in your department, colleagues within your specialty. Maybe the donors of the industry are actually sending out a request for applications, requests for proposals that may find its way into your inbox. Another great way of knowing what grants may be available in the future is to see what was offered the previous year. So for instance, for SEM, EM, and ASEP, looking at those foundational awards, you can pretty much see what was funded last year and have a good idea of what grants may be available during the next application cycle. There are different types of grants. When I talk about intramural, I'm kind of talking about how we fund investigators within our group. So that could be within the department, within an institution. You can look to your affiliate medical schools or universities. And then I kind of put in italics here, the federal NIH. They do offer intramural grants, meaning only people who are employed by the NIH are applicable to getting these grants. These aren't the types of grants that you would be looking for as an emergency medicine investigator applying for one of the institutional grants. When we talk about NIH grants, we're really kind of talking about the extramural grants that they're offering non-NIH employees. There's also national local government grants. Maybe you've seen a lot of this during COVID, talking a little bit about socioeconomic and diversity studies, health services research studies, kind of focusing on making an impact within your local area or region. And then, as I mentioned before, donor and foundation awards, as well as industry sponsored. Industry sponsored has a little bit of a stigma to it, I think, because they're not often aligned with what we may consider best practice. And there may be a little bit more money. And when money gets involved, maybe there's a little bit more bending of morals. But a lot of places, especially in terms of where I'm going next year as research director, industry sponsored may be your best possible source of extramural funding. Another thing to consider is what career level are you? Are you a medical student or resident? Are you a fellow? Are you considered a junior investigator? Typically, 3 to 5 years after either residency or fellowship training, or are you considered like an independent investigator out there applying as your own investigator with enough skills and knowledge to receive these grants on your own. Certain grants are only applicable to certain people of certain career levels. And knowing the type of individual that the grant is looking to fund will help you save time by not submitting to a grant that you're probably not going to get if you're considered too junior or too unqualified. So how do you prepare a grant? Well, the first thing you have to consider is, do you have enough time to write and submit the grant? Things that go into that process would be actually conceptualizing the project. Maybe you have a project idea in mind and you're just looking for the right grant to apply to. Or maybe you get a request for proposal, you read what the criteria and the scope of the grant are, and you can conceptualize a project around that. It's easier to have the project in mind and then tweak it based on the actual details of the grant. But that's entirely up to, that can be entirely hypothetical. It's important to get buy-in from your research team. If you're a junior, especially your mentors, because as we'll see later, that's really important in terms of how these grants are scored and ultimately awarded. Do you have enough time to get IRB approval? Some grants actually require, proof of IRB approval, especially if you're talking about human subjects research before you even apply for the grant. A lot of the grants may have short timelines where you're going to get funding and expected to produce something of scholarly, quality within a year. Well, the IRB approval process could take a large amount of that time, and if you don't have IRB approval going into your grant, work timeline, that could be a significant delay. Are you drafting or perhaps revising an old grant application? Obviously, if you have a previous grant with feedback, it may be easier to revise it and resubmit than it is to write one from scratch. It's important to consider, does your project fit the scope of the award? I kind of mentioned that a little bit already, but definitely want to read the grant, several times, the details of the grant, and make sure that your project fits what they're looking for. Obviously, if your grant does not meet the specific requirements of what the funders are considering, then there's a chance that it's going to be less likely to be accepted. Is the project timeline feasible? Meaning, can you implement and complete the project in the time period that they are allotting you? Whether that's 12 months, 2 years, 3 to 4 years, if you're talking about, junior investigator awards, maybe even longer if we're talking about some larger NIH funded awards. And then finally, which I think is maybe something that we don't often consider, think about previous submissions or people who have maybe gotten that grant in the past. Ask them to see their actual application, because you can get an idea of how to structure it, what's effective, what's ineffective. And also, if you have a similar project, you can kind of see what has been scored well or not so well in the past and use that to your advantage. Now, this is all proprietary information. If you're applying for NIH grants and especially societal grants, this isn't publicly accessible. You would need to ask the actual grant applicant to review it, and they could very well say no, no, thank you. So it really just depends. But from my experience, most people are willing to share their previous grant applications without an issue. How do you write a grant? I think, something about scholarly writing is there's a formula to follow, right? And just as we maybe studied for a certain test to get a good score on a test, you kind of want to write the grant to get a good score on the review. So I think it's important to kind of understand and see how that grant is going to be evaluated, because you kind of want to check all the boxes and make sure that you're writing it in a particular structure or format that's going to get you the highest score possible. When I consider writing scholarly writings, and this could be something as basic as writing the project proposal, the specific aim sheet, writing not applications for grants, but to the IRB, there is a particular structure where you can easily try to transpose your draft from application proposal to the final scholarly writing. So consider that when you're writing it. I do think that'll save you a lot of time. Most people will say that your introduction, discussion, and method section could probably be written before you even start enrolling in the project. And I think recognizing that and using that to your advantage will help you with your productivity and throughput later on. Start with your specific aims. Formulate a hypothesis for each specific aim. And the more specific you get, I think the better chances you'll have in getting a good score. You don't want vague specific aims. You really kind of want to get a little bit more specific to the point where you have a measurable outcome and the researchers understand exactly how you're going to operationalize and measure that as part of your project. People will say, don't give 100 specific aims. It might be a great idea to this project, I'm going to answer so many questions with this project. So your funding is going to go a lot further if you were to fund my project as opposed to someone else. But that may actually, maybe hurt you. If it looks like there's not a lot of focus to your project, you're trying to do too much in a particular time period, that could be a potential weakness. I typically would stick with one primary aim and then up to 2, maybe 3 secondary aims if you think it's necessary. And then obviously you want to describe how you'll attempt to address each specific aim, but we'll get that into more when we talk about the structure of the grant itself. What is going to be really emphasized moving forward is how is this study going to be impactful? What do we already know? What's pre-existing knowledge? What's the gap in the knowledge? And how is your project going to fill that gap? I think if you consider that, very, very few projects are completely exploratory, where we know nothing about something and we're just going to go out there and measure something to see if there maybe a relationship exists. I think the stronger applications are, this is what's already known. There's some sort of foundation of knowledge. This is the gap, and this is how we're going to address that gap. And then coming up with very specific aims and how you'll measure that as part of your project, I think would be considered a stronger application. Another category that's often evaluated is, how is this innovative? Is your approach original? Is it creative? Is it of sound methodology? Is the study design appropriate? Is the way that you're analyzing your data valid? And then do you have maybe a specific way that you're going to recruit subjects? Maybe you have a large database or a particular patient population that is rare or we don't really have access to. Those could all be considered innovative aspects of a project, and you'll actually have an opportunity to describe how your project is innovative and be scored on it as part of the grant review. You want to focus on your approach. This is kind of what most people think about when they're writing their grants, like what's the actual project, the intervention that we're doing. But it's only really 20% of how the grant is scored if you're talking about traditional NIH scoring rubrics. It's specific to the project, and this is really where you can ask for feedback, I think. Other researchers, mentors, you can review peer review publications, pull all that information in to strengthen your approach. Because this is, I think, as a researcher, what we think is the most important part of a project, most important part of a grant. Finally, statistical analyses. You'll definitely want to include something about the data, the outcomes you're going to measure, how you're going to analyze it. I would say if you're going to do some sort of prospective trial, a power analysis to get an appropriate sample size calculation is a must. And then you may not require specifics, but just saying that you have a stats department who's going to review all your data for you without a clear-cut plan may not be enough. And it may be an area where reviewers may criticize your grant. Another thing that's looked at is environment and resources, and this goes back to making sure that the project can be completed, right? Is it feasible? Does your system, does your department have everything you need to execute and complete this project within the timeline? This could go as far as like your clinical setting. So do you have the patients of interest to include? Maybe there's a really rare disease or with a low prevalence in your department that you want to study. Well, in order to hit your sample size, how long is it going to take you to enroll those patients? If it's going to be years, I can probably say that without including other sites for enrollment, it's going to look weak. There's going to be an issue in terms of completing that project, which may be of criticism. And then there's also non-clinical setting when you talk about the environment and resources. And when I think of this, I think more of ancillary support and more informatics and technical support. So what is your EHR? Do you have a way of abstracting data, generating reports? Do you have an informatics team, a biostats team? Who's your IRB? How well staffed are they? How busy are they? What's their turnaround time? I have a fancy office. Look at this. Maybe that's important, so I can come in and do some work in sort of a protected space. Do you have the appropriate technology? Do you have the appropriate IT if the project calls for it? We're in the Simulation Academy project. Do you have a simulation center and all the necessary equipment to do your project? And all of this may require some sort of ancillary and relevant staff. So certainly something that you want to talk about. Large academic institutions, like where a lot of the panelists are coming from, it's much easier to justify and support research at those places than a smaller community shop or a smaller academic institution where there isn't really an infrastructure in place for doing research. Finally, your mentorship team. So when you consider mentors, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're content experts, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're leading experts doing research in your particular area of interest. There's other strengths and experiences that mentors can bring to your mentorship team to strengthen it and provide some sort of support. For instance, maybe there's someone involved in stats. Maybe there's someone who's really good at study design or methodology. Maybe you're doing implementation science and you want an implementation scientist involved. Don't think that your mentor team necessarily needs to have content expertise or even be within your specialty. Kind of get the team together that you think will be the most helpful in terms of executing your project and ensuring that your results are meaningful. I would recommend having a track record of collaboration with these individuals. If you show a track record of collaborating, working together, having a publication record, it'll definitely look better on your application than some randos, right, who just happen to be in your department, who really has no invested interest, in the grant itself, who may look good on paper, but may not be as effective as a mentor or collaborator as you may think. Finally, when you're talking about junior investigator awards, kind of like we're on that now, having someone who has experience mentoring previous grant awardees will definitely go a long way. So one of the issues I've had at Bay State, one of the issues I'm going to have when I go down with my new position at Memorial is there's no NIH funded researchers in my department, right? So having a mentorship team, assembling my mentorship team and applying for an NIH award without any previous NIH awardees may be an obstacle that may be difficult to surpass without reaching out to other departments, other sites, or looking, like that I may have mentioned other departments with a track record of engagement. How is it scored? So it's reviewed and scored by whoever the group is. We get into details about NIH. I don't think that's necessarily the focus here. It gets a little bit complicated, but you're facing their hands. They may not be content experts. They have no idea what your grant is even about. They may not even be from your specialty. And sure enough, someone on that review team may not even be a clinician. They may not have any clinical experience. So it's completely random who actually gets that grant at the end of the day and who's actually reviewing it and essentially assessing the scores. So you really don't have a lot of control over that. You can actually recommend maybe individuals in a particular group who may have some sort of content expertise would be better off reviewing those grants, but very rarely is that in your control. So what determines whether the grant gets funding? Well, there's a cutoff, right? It's if it goes above the score, or I should say under the score, right? Because lower scores are better. It's like golf. But if it's a score beyond the threshold for funding, you'll get approved. And if it's below, if the score is just not good enough, then it will get declined. The scoring cutoffs may not be transparent. And at the end of the day, you may see your scores, but there may not be standardized criteria that you can actually go and look at to see how you receive that score. And that could be one of the most frustrating things I think about being a grant applicant. For the NIH, there's 5 scored review criteria, and I kind of mentioned this when I was talking about how to write your grant. Significance, the investigators, is the project innovative, what's your approach, and then environment and resources. This is a scoring rubric from the NIH. As I mentioned before, it's scored, each category is scored from 1 to 9. The lower the score, the better. 1 through 3 is considered a high degree of impact. Those are usually strong scores. And you'll need most of the scores to be 1 through 3 in order to eventually get funding. All right. So what happens after it's scored? Well, it's either approved. Congratulations. You have to get to work, Hillary Moss, and doing all these projects that you promised you do and deliver on. And then I think it's important to have maybe this is the step I'm applying for now, but what's the next step even? Like the results I get from this project, how am I going to gather momentum and use this information to fund future investigations, and whether or not that requires funding? How am I going to use this information to support future grant funding? Or if you're like me, most of the time your funding gets declined. In which case, don't lose hope. It's just like relationships, you're not a loser. It's not the end of the world. There's plenty of fish in the sea. Reviews may be fickle. You may be completely irate with some of the comments you got back. You mentioned I didn't do a sample size calculation. Well, it's literally in the grant under power analysis. Unfortunately, under extremes, with the exception of extreme circumstances, very rarely will you submit a grant for re-review, unless you think there was some blatant sort of issue with the review process. Sometimes there's a separate review committee that will provide a second review. Comments may focus on intangibles, things that you can't fix. Yeah, I'm a junior investigator. That's why I'm applying for a junior investigator award, right? There's just nothing, I want more research experience, but I can't get more research experience, or I don't have grant experience because I've never gotten grants because I'm junior. Those things are kind of out of your hands. But if you strategize and talk to your mentors and your research team, there are certain ways of addressing these comments to strengthen the application should you decide to resubmit. And then I think it's always important to really kind of take to heart, analyze, and incorporate that feedback into your revision if you are planning on revising and resubmitting it. Are you going to submit next cycle? Are you going to consider other sources of funding? I think it's done on purpose, but SEM Foundation, EM Foundation, there's a 6-month difference in terms of when those requests for applications are due. I think specifically for this reason, I don't know though. And then it's not unusual for people to submit their application to multiple sources of funding with ongoing review process, with the thought being, well, if I don't get this one, maybe this one will accept it. I don't want to miss the application deadline. And it is okay that if you actually get funding from one of the grants to either accept or withdraw based on the responses from the other funding sources. You don't want to be in a situation where you're essentially applying for every grant under the sun with the same project and accepting all the grants at once. You'll have to disclose that. But it is appropriate and okay to submit to multiple grant funding sources at once and wait to hear back and then make a decision based on the responses. So maybe not for us per se in terms of the specifics, but one of the things I've been doing a lot as a fellow that I think has been really helpful is reviewing other people's grants. Why? Am I getting anything specific out of this? No. Am I spending a lot of time doing this? Sure. But I think there's an educational opportunity here to see exactly how other people write their grants and maybe pull what's effective, what's ineffective from that grant application to then therefore use for your future grant submissions. This could be something as easy as structure or format. It could be language. It could be maybe a particular topic that you're kind of seeing how someone else with a similar research focus is submitting a grant. Maybe you can use that to your advantage with your own endeavor. And then if you get a grant back or you review the grant and get their score, you can actually look at the actual feedback from the grant reviewers, see how the scoring criteria was applied, and then utilize that knowledge in terms of how you're going to structure, write, and then submit your own grant. And then I think one of the coolest things I've had an opportunity to do is sit in on a grant review where literally, the 3 reviewers who were assigned the grant beforehand came in, they gave a quick synopsis, they went through the scores, and they listed reasons for their scores, and then they essentially deliberated on it, and then essentially had to make a decision for the entire group as to whether the funding was going to get approved or not. Kind of hearing how people think in that process, I think, is really helpful. And if you had a grant accepted for SEM and EM foundations, you'll be able to maybe sit through one of those mock reviews should you attend the workshop. Okay. That's all I have. I'm happy to open this up for specific questions, other panelists, obviously. And then I put my contact here. Yes, I put 3-4 months. I put my personal email here, a Gmail account, because I'll be transitioning into my next position outside of the current health system in July. I'm not sure how long I'll have access to the basic health network. So I just wanted to make that opportunity, make that contact available to people should they want to follow up. Okay. So with that, I'll stop share and I'll mute.
All right. Thank you so much. That was a really good review. So we'll have each of our panelists talk about the simulation, about their simulation project, and then a little bit about the grant that they got. Hillary, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. So the project that I'm doing is looking at creating a simulation-based palliative care curriculum for the EM residents. It kind of started with one of my residents coming up to me and being like, I want to do more palliative care sim, because he wanted to be a palliative care fellow, which he is now. And it kind of spiraled from there because I was noticing that with all these holds that we're having in our department and patients staying in our ED for 3 days and us having to hold a lot of sicker patients because there are no beds anywhere, that we were doing a lot of palliative care in the ER, but we felt really uncomfortable with it. That the idea of having these really hard conversations and giving patients glycopyrrolate and Dilaudid and things like that for not our usual complaints felt very foreign to us, and we would rather call somebody else and have them tell us what to do instead of us just doing it ourselves. And so I kind of bought into the palliative care thing, and we kind of started rolling from there and started making sim cases and started looking up kind of what's even out there, and realized that there really wasn't anything out there. That, there's kind of like 1-day sessions telling you like one piece of how to do palliative care, but there wasn't really necessarily a full like longitudinal curriculum for us. And so, having been a little bit involved in the pediatric curriculum that got made for sim, the Rescue Peds book, I kind of was like, it'd be really interesting to do something similar, but do it with palliative care. So that's kind of where this all started. And then I presented it at the Sim Fellow Forum last year at SAM and got a lot of really valuable feedback on the project there. And then was like, oh, it would be really awesome if I had money to hire standardized patients, because the Sims would be a lot better if I didn't have my residents filling in as patient family members. And so, having applied for the novice grant once before and having not gotten it, but gaining a lot of experience in how to actually write the grant, I was like, all right, let's do it. And I wrote it up, and pretty much everything Eric said is like 100% true. having already kind of like done the project a little bit and like really gotten my feet wet into palliative care and having a lot of that background knowledge of like what I wanted to do and why it was important, made it a lot easier to write the grant. Having already done this once and not gotten it, I kind of knew what I was getting myself into. Like when I did it the first time, I think I started writing it like 3 weeks before it was due. I didn't see a problem with that because I just didn't know. And then as I was doing it, I was like, oh, this is a lot of work. And then when I submitted it, my mentor was like, yeah, people usually do this over like months and not over weeks. So good job for finishing it, but you should have done it a little bit longer, but I didn't know. So I knew this time, so I gave myself more time. And when you're writing an NIH style grant, it's very different in terms of like the language that you use and how you present information. And so kind of knowing now what they want made it a little bit easier to write it, but it was still a frustrating experience. Ultimately, I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I got it. I'm happy that my residents will get a good experience this next year. But, you know, I got all the comments back and they, you know, they're still constructive and they still want you to try and improve your project even after you've gotten the grant. And you read all these comments, you're like, oh, these comments weren't very good. Like, I guess I'm not getting the grant. And then you get it and you're like, oh. And then you're like, okay, now I'm going to apply to another like 5 things and I'm not going to get them. And then maybe the 6th one I'll get. But it's a lot of trial and error. And if you've never seen one before, it's really difficult. So I think having an example one to look at to get a sense of like what this particular grant is looking for is very helpful. And that's what I have to say about that.
So I have a couple of slides which I'll quickly share, nothing too long. And there we go. So Diane already did a really nice introduction. Just, you know, one thing which wasn't mentioned in the introduction was, and just to link back to what Eric was saying, was I also review grants for the Health Research Services Administration and a number of other organizations. And, you know, I don't have any disclosures related to this. And, you know, everything that I'm going to talk about is sort of my own opinions. And so just to a little bit of a recap, a little bit about sort of my research history and career, and a little bit, I think, why Diane asked me to talk today. So it started off, 15 years ago or so, with a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and AHRQ grant for about $75,000 in total, focusing on bridging the gap between EMS and health services research. And this was a small conference grant that we got to host a conference of some thought leaders to talk about some of these issues. And that was with a project team from the Center for State Health Policy in New Jersey and a number of other folks that parlayed itself into a $1.3 million AHRQ grant, a comparative effectiveness research grant looking at pre-hospital and hospital emergency care of therapeutic hypothermia. And then a couple of years later, I got a grant intramural from local institutions where I was working to look at some OR team training and crisis management stuff. And then a couple of years after that, I got a small grant to look at Google Glass for utilizing that for emergency care. And then a couple of years ago, a little bit larger grant for Mount Sinai, where I'm currently looking at competency-based assessment. And then the grant that Diana was mentioning was the Dover Spunt grant from Enaxel, which was a $1,000 grant. And so it's kind of the smallest of all of those awards, but it's the one that I'm currently working on. And the project is looking at Luminaire's effect on stress level of emergency care providers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But one of the things I'm going to say is sort of like the way I got started. I never thought of myself as much of a researcher, but the way I really got started was working with a bunch of project teams. And I think really, collaborating with individuals who are at different stages of their career that you can jump onto and lend your voice to their project, I think is really, really valuable. And then, the other thing is, like, even though it was almost 10 years ago, the Google Glass project, that work sort of was foundational in many ways. And so I'm a consultant on a grant. I have a colleague of mine who got a National Science Foundation grant this year looking at head-worn technologies for EMS care. And we're going to do that in the simulated environment. I'm a consultant on that. And the way that we got connected was through the work that I did almost a decade ago. And so, it's, again, sort of those teams and paying it forward. And so the Deborah Spunt grant that I'm currently working on, just so, pay respects to the individual that the grant is named after. Deborah Spunt was a pioneer in clinical simulation in nursing. She was co-founder of the organization that Diana was talking about, INACSL, which is the International Nursing Association for Clinical Simulation and Learning. She was the first president of the organization. She worked at the University of Maryland School of Nursing, and she died of cancer at the relatively young age of 50. And so the foundation was started with support of Laerdal to honor Deborah's work. And so the grant that I received is looking at the effects of light on our clinicians' stress levels. And so the grant that the Deborah Spunt grant went to supporting the getting certain materials for that project, namely an artificial intelligent AI sensor that participants will wear that will measure their heart rate variability during the before, during, and after a simulated clinical session. And then what we're going to do is we're changing the color of lights that these individuals are exposed to see if the lighting will affect their stress levels and their return to baseline. And so regardless of the project that you're working on, I think there's a couple of key things, and that's sort of the message here. And when we look at it, I'm going to sort of start with this one over here in the corner, which is finding that team. No project can be done in isolation. And so with this current project that I'm working on, we are collaboratively working with lighting researchers here at Mount Sinai from the Lighting Research Center, the head-worn display project I'm working on with a colleague who is a health services researcher. And so really finding a team, whether you're a junior clinician or a junior researcher or a more seasoned person, you need to bring in that diversity of ideas. And it's a really great opportunity to sort of learn the ropes from other people. So that's number one in my mind. And then workshop the idea. We're collaborating with another institution on a project right now, anesthesia, emergency medicine, and then another institution. And they said, we can bring this to our research focus group, our research workshop group, and take advantage of those opportunities if you have them before you submit your grants. We have one here at Mount Sinai for our department, for our division, but go and share your ideas. It'll only make your grant application that much stronger because you're going to get those diverse perspectives and you're going to get those external reviewers or relatively external reviewers to the project. There are so many times where you're like typing something and you're like, going off on this tangent that makes complete sense to you. But it doesn't make any sense when you go back and read it or somebody else reads it, right? But you can read it 15 times and it makes complete sense. So having those internal, external people review it is really valuable. And so, obviously you need to have that idea. You need to conceptualize that idea and then clearly sort of lay out the need and your plan for the project. But as Eric was saying, sort of read those requirements, really go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And figure out what the requirements are. And that sort of links into sort of meeting the deadlines over here. Mark it on your calendar, realize that the application process and their deadlines are not necessarily all the deadlines you need to meet for your own organization. If you have to go through different channels within your organization to get grant approval or to apply, don't leave it to the last minute to create your login for the website. And sometimes you log in and what they're asking for in their application is not exactly what matches in their materials and their request for proposals. So you need to sort of, ensure that they're congruent. Sometimes you've written up this beautiful program and then there's this word limit that they didn't disclose earlier on. So just make sure that you've met the deadlines, but have logged in and gotten all the materials. And I think this links back to what Eric and Hillary was saying, right? You want to build on your previous work, but make sure that it's unique, right? And let's make sure it sort of stands alone, but that there's a foundation on which you're building, and making those linkages, right? So whether it's between departments, between organizations, between previous work that you're doing, I think that's also really, really, really valuable. And then the last piece there, and it's funny, I remember talking to somebody a number of years ago. I was like, so how did you get involved with this project? It's a little bit different. And they're like, you follow the money. right? And so you see what's available out there from a grant perspective. And if you need to reshape or retool your project to fit their requirements, like that's what you do as a researcher. You're going to, sort of take half a step to the left or right out of your initial idea because it fits the funder's goals and requirements a whole lot more. So, if there was sort of a key takeaway, those would sort of be the 5 or 6 big things that I would really focus on as you're thinking about developing your grant applications and grant proposals going forward. Places to look for grants, and we quickly mentioned this, but SSH, the Society for Simulation in Healthcare, has an early career grant. You have to have less than $10,000 in total of funding prior to applying to this grant. Obviously, you all know about the SAEM Novice Research Grant. There's also the Deborah Spunt Research Grant, but there's also things, I know this one's hard to see, but this is through the Department of Education, I believe. This is the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education Modeling and Simulation Programs. And so, there are a number of diverse groups out there that you can apply to try and get funding for your projects. And so here's my contact information. Happy to talk about any and all of this stuff. But I'm going to stop sharing and leave some time for a bit of a discussion and any questions that you all have.
Yeah, if you're waiting for me to tell you my story, I'm gonna hold off. I think Jared's right. I think we should leave some time for open discussion and some questions for the panelists. I'm not that interesting.
Eric, you are super interesting, but that sounds good. If there's any audience members who wants to pose a question, just unmute, or you can put it in the chat. I'll be watching out for it as well. So I have one question. So when I first did my first outside grant, I was kind of like echoing a lot of things that you guys have already mentioned. I was very surprised with all of the little details and the different things that pop up that you need to include within the grant. So at Mount Sinai, I know we have like a grants office. In your guys' institutions, is there a grant and research office, and what do they do to like help you out?
So there is one, but I didn't know it existed until after I submitted. So they weren't particularly helpful to me, but they theoretically would have been if I knew they existed.
Yeah, we have a SPA. It's a Sponsored Programs Administration. They're involved with all pre and post award funding. It's like it used to be 3 people. It's now 2 people. They're totally unresponsive. It took me 4 months to get them to even review and just sign the cover sheet for the application. For me, at least where I am currently, where I was a resident, it's very much different, I'm sure. But for me, it's actually more of an obstacle than it is a facilitator, I think, in terms of writing grants. It goes back to what Jared was saying, like always give yourself extra time to take care of all these housekeeping paperwork issues. It's not that you write a grant and you can submit it. Oftentimes it needs to be reviewed and signed off by multiple people, your department chair, maybe one of them, mentors. You need letters of support oftentimes, bio sketches. If you don't have an active bio sketch, start working on it now. It's a recommendation I'd give. But these ancillary support teams, like where they're supposed to help you review and maybe achieve and get these grants, oftentimes could be a huge deterrent. So it really depends on your shop. I would just suggest maybe reaching out to some of the investigators who work where you work and just seeing if these resources exist, and then if so, what specifically can they offer. We're recently affiliated with UMass. UMass is a much larger academic institution than Bay State is. They have everything. This is more of the from the Clinical Scientists Institute, not necessarily clinicians, but people with PhDs doing research. They offer a great lecture series, didactics, workshops. They actually have like writing review committees. You can join a K Award club where they'll actually review your grants and discuss it in an open forum. And that's with the Associated Medical School and with the CETSI, not necessarily within my own department. So I think it's important to see where you are. If it's not online or it's not transparent online, just ask people and they may be able to point you in the right direction.
So there's a question in the chat. how do you find good mentors if your institution does not have any experts in a particular area that you're interested in?
Yeah, as I mentioned
So,
before, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say, I think there's a couple of ways of going about that. You know, most times your institution's not going to have the experts that you need. So one way is to just to meet people, right, at conferences, and to make those connections when you go to your societal meetings or you know, other workshops. I think the other thing is, you know, don't be afraid to just send an email, right, to those individuals who have done work in those areas. You've got wonderful resources as part of the Sim Academy, right? You've got Ambrose, who's, you know, does amazing work. You've got Susie Bentley and Mike Casara, and you've got these people in SAEM through the Sim Academy who have been there. And so one of the really nice things I have found in the simulation community over the last couple of years, or not even a couple of years, probably 20 years, is that people are just willing to help, and people are just super nice. And so, like, don't be afraid to just reach out, and you know, throw your idea, and people are always looking to collaborate. That's, you know, I literally sent an email to a colleague at the project that we're working on right now, and I was like, hey, what do you think of this idea, because you're the experts in resuscitation science. And he was like, oh, let me put you in touch with my entire team. Right. And so all of a sudden we got 14 more people and 14 more ideas and 14 more, you know, cooks in the kitchen. But like, that's only going to make our project stronger. So Eric, wait, I know you were going to add something to that.
Yeah, no, I kind of mentioned this before. Like, so there's different types of mentors. You can have a content expert and non-content expert. Somebody's going to make your project stronger, increase the innovation, the clout, make the reviewers of your grant, you know, confident that you're going to get the project done as you described. I don't want this to round to an entire mentorship subcommittee hour. We can talk hours about what it means to assemble a good mentorship team. I think back in the day, and I'm 32, you know, I am a second year fellow. When I say back in the day, I don't know what that means, but back in the day before COVID, I think really your mentors had to be in shop, like they had to be in your department, in your institution at least. And I think the reason behind that is there needed to be some sort of invested interest of that mentor to make sure you succeed as an investigator and as a mentee. If you have someone across the country as a mentor on your project in a different department, different institution with a bunch of stuff on their list with a bunch of other mentees, you can make an argument, or it may appear that maybe they're not as invested in mentoring you specifically, and therefore they're going to be a little bit more absent in terms of mentorship on the project. I think after COVID and the fact that we realized, hey, remote conferencing and teleconferencing just as good as meeting in person. And you can be just as involved in a project, or succeed as a mentor without necessarily being in the same shop, or at least in the same geographic region as the individual, works just as well. So I think we're a little bit looser in terms of allowing for mentors outside of your shop, outside of your department. I mean, you probably know. I mean, there's good mentors, there's bad mentors. Jared mentioned like getting deferred or like at least bounced to like 14 more people. Yeah, maybe that's great. I mean, you have 14 more opinions, 14 more ideas, 14 more skill sets, but the more mentors you have, that can actually be detrimental, right? Especially if they start disagreeing with one another. And then like, who do you listen to, right? So this is, like I said, a whole nother topic we can discuss at length. My answer would be focus on, see what your project needs, and if it's in close proximity, great. If not, then reaching out to other departments, and I think at some extent other institutions would be fine. But really make sure that they're willing to mentor you, right? Because the last thing you want is your primary mentor to be absent, to be against the project, to really not offer you the help and the services that you expected. And I think being upfront and clear about that when you establish that mentee-mentor relationship is really important.
There's also some formalized programs out there for novice researchers, which helps structure and formalize that mentor-mentee relationship. You know, and I'll, you know, having whether or not it's an official mentor or someone you're pulling in who has more experience, who's helping you with this particular project. I mean, I guess there's different, obviously, like we all know, and Eric was saying, there's different levels of those mentor-mentee relationships. But yeah, so whether or not it's internal or external, build that network of people that you can call upon. Sometimes you might need them more, sometimes you might need them less, but it really is about building those relationships and those networks.
Another
I
question.
thought you were driving. I hope you're parked somewhere.
No.
Chat.
Actually, we're taking turns, so my husband is driving now.
All right, great.
Good to take turns. So another question in the chat is a lot of Sim Academy members are not as experienced and feel intimidated to start applying. How did you start applying and putting your application together? Like, how did you get over that initial hump?
Yeah, like I said, I think there's two ways of approaching grants. Either you're actively seeking out grants and then creating a project, conceptualizing a project. Ambrose, you probably get this question asked a lot too. Maybe that's why you're asking us. I think there's two ways of approaching it. Either you have a research project that you're really passionate about, really interested in, and then you kind of find a grant request for proposal, RFA, RFP that fits that project, or you can maybe tweak your project a little bit to fit the needs and the scope of the grant. Or you just go around and seek out any sort of grants and then be like, all right, I'm going to create a project based on what the grant is calling for because I, wanted this project. I think the first question that none of us really talked about is, does your project even need money? Like, do you need money to do your project? And I know for more maybe some more advanced investigators, like time is money. So it's going to look, I need time to do this project, and time means time not working clinically. And then talking to your colleagues, your groups, your department chairs to see if you can get buy down time. And if not, can I get grant funding to support that buy down time? But I think the first question is, do I even need money to this project? And if the answer is no, then I would say probably not necessary to apply a grant. Now, obviously there's prestige associated with getting grants. Getting grants, no matter how big or how small the grants are, begets more grants. But if you're, just looking for some buy down, $5,000 grant to buy you down a certain number of hours, so you do much, I think that may be a little bit critiqued on the review. If you're looking for equipment, if you're looking for support staff, if you're looking for patient reimbursement, something like that, if you can put those hard costs in your grant and justify your budget, I think a little bit more strongly, I think funders are going to recognize that and see this project is great. It cannot be done without funding. We're going to give them the funding to do this project. For me, I had tons of ideas, like just a whirlwind of ideas, and I wanted to do the projects. And then I just kind of looked at the foundational grants and said, hey, this project would be great for this grant. I'm going to write the application. And sure enough, here we are talking about it. But that's not necessarily the approach to all grants. And I think it really depends on what you're trying to do, if you need funding, or if you're looking just to get funding, and then in which case you can come up with the project and start the application. Hopefully
I also think that a bad first draft is better than just a blank application. So I got this advice from somebody in the faculty incubator, actually, when you're starting to write manuscripts and things like that, having just a draft of whatever it is that you're applying for, even if it's horrible and needs hours and hours of revision, is still a step in the right direction and still a place to go. And so I think getting over that first hump and just starting to fill out even just your name and the title of your project and things like that, that's a little bit of progress in the beginning of the grant and kind of helps get you over that initial oh my God, this is going to be so much work. What am I doing?
All right.
I start with the specific games too. I think if you can really kind of focus in your specific games and come up with an approach of how you're going to answer those questions, that's I think the most important part of your approach. The rest, when you talk about CVs and biosketches and letters of support, yes, there are nuances to that. You shouldn't just boilerplate and answer all those questions and submit it. I think at least from my conversations with some of the grant managers at SEM and EMF grant workshop, they're going to be focusing more on a personalized biosketch, a personalized letter of support. What are your other clinical and non-clinical responsibilities? Are you going to be able to deliver on the project that you're proposing here? I think as we kind of stretch ourselves really thin, it's going to be sort of more of an emphasis in terms of when they review the grant applications moving forward. And I think starting with the specific aims, getting an idea of your approach, soundboarding that, the rest, as you get more experience writing grants, seem a little bit more boilerplate. Like, okay, yeah, I know how to do the biosketch. I know how to do the CV. I know how to do a budget justification. That stuff comes with time, I think. And I think reviewing previous grants to get an idea of how other people have done it could help you with your own.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I want to thank all of our panelists for that great discussion. It was really helpful to everybody. We are going to have our next mentor hour on May 9th at 4 p.m. Eastern time. It's going to be about advanced degrees and if they're worth it or not, which hopefully the answer will be yes, because I am doing one right now.
Do you have panelists for that? I'd love to.
Yeah, I have a couple pending, depending on schedules and stuff. But yeah, it should be a good discussion. Right now, mostly the panelists are masters in like medical education orientated. So either MHPEs or like MEDs. But I'm hoping to get like an MBA or something else to kind of diversify the panel.
I'm 15 credits away from my MPH. I wish I had listened to this panel before doing the work.
All right. Well, everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.